Female CEO Vivian Lockwood ordered Noah Calder arrested the moment she saw the single father step out of the classified records room holding an encrypted drive in his hand. Standing before her entire executive board, she accused him of stealing proprietary data from a $3 billion infrastructure project and demanded police handcuff him immediately. Noah did not resist. He only said she was arresting the wrong man. When Police Chief Harold Brenner opened the wallet and found a black federal card inside, the color drained from his face. He removed the cuffs, turned to his officers, and ordered, "Release him, now. If you believe the truth is stronger than any boardroom, follow Noah as he unmasks the man pulling the strings." Lockwood Tower rose 49 floors above the financial district of Graybridge, Maryland. And on the morning that would later be called the longest 36 hours in the company's history, the building hummed with the particular voltage of enormous expectation. The lobby had been dressed for the occasion. Frosted glass panels bearing the North Star grid logo, temporary lighting rigs installed by a crew that had worked through the night, and a receiving area where senators, transportation officials, and wire journalists were scheduled to arrive in less than 2 days for the ceremonial launch of a $3 billion automated rail control network. Vivian Lockwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 45th floor, arms folded across her chest, watching the morning traffic grid far below with the expression of someone who had spent the better part of a decade building toward a single moment and intended to let nothing interrupt it. She had not slept more than 4 hours, but she would not have admitted it to anyone in the building. The project was on schedule. The demonstration units were live, and every member of her board had signed off on the final compliance certificates the previous afternoon. The alarm that changed everything activated at 7:14 in the morning, triggered by a proximity sensor outside the restricted archive room on the 47th floor. The 47th floor housed the physical backup drives for the North Star control architecture, not the working servers, but the verified originals that the company's legal team kept sealed and cataloged for federal audit purposes. Pierce Danner, head of security for Lockwood Meridian Systems, reached the corridor first, with Vivian and Chief Operating Officer Grant Halston arriving less than a minute behind him. What they found was a man standing in the hallway outside the archive door, holding a matte black encrypted drive in one gloved hand, dressed in the standard gray coveralls of a contract maintenance technician. Noah Calder was 44 years old, built lean, with the kind of stillness about him that could be mistaken for boredom by people who didn't know the difference between a man who had nothing to say and a man who was saying nothing on purpose. He did not flinch when the three of them rounded the corner. He did not look surprised. Pierce spoke first, his voice pitched for the benefit of the executive staff who had followed Vivian down from the floor above. He said Noah had used a stolen access badge to enter the archive, that internal logs showed an unauthorized data transfer, and that Noah had been planning to deliver copied source code to a competitor before the launch window closed. Every sentence was delivered with the practiced certainty of someone who had rehearsed it. Vivian listened without interrupting, her gaze moving between Pierce and the drive in Noah's hand, calculating the damage in real time, not to the company's safety record or its engineering, but to the launch timeline and the eyes of the federal representatives who would be standing in the lobby in 40 hours. Noah waited until Pierce finished, then he spoke in an even, unhurried tone and said that before anyone made a decision they could not reverse, Vivian should lock the main servers and issue a hold on the launch. Because something inside the North Star system was not what the certification said it was. Vivian heard it as a threat and ordered the arrest. She was precise about the instruction: cuffs, escort off the premises, criminal complaint filed before noon. And she did not look at Noah as she said it. He did not argue. He extended his wrists without expression, and when the officers from the on-site security detail moved forward, he simply said in a voice quiet enough that only those nearest to him could hear that she was making a mistake. Police Chief Harold Brenner had responded personally, because the incident flag had classified the event under a federal infrastructure protection protocol, and protocols of that category required a senior law enforcement presence. He was the kind of man who read badges carefully, and when he opened the wallet that a security officer had removed from Noah's jacket and handed to him, he went still. The card inside was not a contractor ID. It bore the seal of the Office of Inspector General of the United States Department of Transportation, along with a mission classification code that Harold Brenner recognized from a briefing he had attended 8 months earlier. He removed the handcuffs himself, turned to the officers beside him, and said, "Release him. Right now." The executive floor went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the ground shifts under people who thought they were standing on solid concrete. Noah straightened his collar, looked past Vivienne toward the display monitors running the live North Star feed on the far wall, and said that someone in this room had just sent a deletion command to the entire safety archive. Harold Brenner did not raise his voice when he confirmed Noah's identity to the assembled executives. He simply stated the facts the way a man states facts, when he knows they are going to rearrange everything in the room and there is no point in softening them. Noah Calder was a senior special agent assigned to the Office of Inspector General, currently embedded in Lockwood Meridian Systems under a sealed investigation order, and his operational status was known to exactly 2 individuals in Graybridge, Harold himself and a federal prosecutor in Baltimore who had signed the authorization 4 months earlier. The investigation had not been disclosed to the CEO, the board, or the legal department, because all of them had been designated as potential subjects until evidence cleared them. Vivienne absorbed this with the particular fury of someone who has spent years demanding transparency from every layer of their organization and has just discovered that the same standard had been applied to her. She asked how a federal agent could spend 4 months inside her company without her knowledge, and Noah answered the question directly, without apology, because if she had known, whoever was moving money out of the North Star budget would have known within the hour. The room shifted again. Avery Sloan, Lockwood Meridian's chief legal counsel, stepped forward and asked to examine the credentials and the sealed authorization independently, thorough and methodical, and unwilling to accept Harold's confirmation without documentation she could review herself. Noah handed both items over without hesitation and waited while she read through them with the focused silence of someone who bills by the hour and never wastes a minute of it. When she looked up, she confirmed that the authorization was valid, that the mission scope covered everything from contract fraud to infrastructure sabotage, and that any interference with the ongoing investigation now carried federal criminal exposure for every person in the hallway. Grant Halston stood near the back of the group with his hands in his jacket pockets and his expression arranged into something that resembled controlled outrage. He said Noah had exceeded his mandate, that embedding an agent without board notification violated the terms of the federal contract, and that the company's lawyers would be filing an immediate challenge. His voice carried the measured authority of a man accustomed to being the oldest and most experienced person in any room. Noah did not argue with him. He acknowledged that legal challenges were Grant's right, and then said he had 3 things he needed Vivienne to look at before anyone made any further decisions about what rights they intended to exercise. The first was a set of safety test results for the North Star Collision Avoidance Protocol. Not the versions currently in the company's official file, but the originals recovered from a backup partition that Pierce's team had missed during a system sweep 6 weeks earlier. The originals showed that a simulation run in the third month of testing had placed 2 trains on a converging track for 11 seconds before an operator overrode the system manually. The version of that same report in the official archive described the event as a minor sensor calibration deviation of no operational significance. The second item was a contractor payment ledger showing disbursements to 7 subcontractors across the previous 18 months, all of which had cleared compliance review, except that 3 of the company names did not match any registered entities in Maryland, Delaware, or Virginia. The third was a line of code flagged in a system architecture review that Noah had conducted under the cover of his routine maintenance role. No designation in the official codebase, dormant inside the train routing module, nested 6 layers below the interface that certified engineers reviewed during standard audits. Pierce told the room that the camera footage clearly showed Noah removing the drive without authorization. Noah responded by asking to see the unedited footage rather than the segment that had been clipped and time-stamped. Before anyone could pull up the full recording, the central camera server on the 47th floor went offline. The deletion command that had originated from Vivienne's executive account carried a timestamp of 7:09 in the morning, 5 minutes before the archive alarm triggered, and 11 minutes before Vivienne had arrived on the 47th floor. The gap was not a technical error. Avery pointed it out quietly and watched Vivienne's expression move through surprise and then into the harder territory of someone realizing that the ground beneath them has been undermined for longer than they knew. Vivienne stated flatly that she had not been at her workstation at 7:09. She had been in the executive conference room on the 45th floor with 6 other people, including Harold Brenner's liaison officer, who could confirm her location. The timestamp proved that someone with access to her credentials had been operating her account without her presence. And the question that followed that fact, who, and for how long, was the question that began to change the shape of every other answer in the room. Noah asked for Vivienne's authentication device, the hardware token used to confirm high-clearance commands. He examined it for less than a minute before he found what he was looking for, evidence that the device's cryptographic certificate had been cloned, meaning a duplicate existed somewhere that could generate commands indistinguishable from hers. He also found traces of audio collection software on the mobile device she used for board calls. Not the kind of software that announced itself in a permissions menu, but a passive listener installed at the firmware level, designed to capture voice samples sufficient to replicate authentication patterns in systems that used vocal confirmation. The installer's signature pointed to a maintenance window 6 months earlier during a routine security upgrade that Pierce Danner's department had overseen. A device no larger than a thumbnail had been found beneath the underside of Vivienne's primary desk, embedded in the cable management tray, transmitting to an external relay at irregular intervals that corresponded, Noah noted without raising his voice, to every significant decision meeting Vivienne had held in that office over the previous half-year. The only personnel with unescorted access to the executive office suite during non-business hours were Grant Halston, Pierce Danner, and 2 members of the after-hours facilities team. Grant responded the way he always responded when the walls began to close, calmly and with considerable institutional authority. He told the assembled board members and legal staff that the evidence Noah was presenting was circumstantial, that it was being used to deflect from the fact that a federal agent had been secretly embedded in the company without proper disclosure, and that the appropriate next step was to convene an emergency board session to consider placing Vivienne on temporary administrative leave while an independent auditor reviewed the situation. He framed it as a matter of protecting the company from liability and he framed it with the practiced warmth of a man who had been framing things in boardrooms for 2 decades. Noah told the room that convening that vote was precisely what the person who had installed the surveillance device would want them to do, because the moment Vivian's authority was suspended, the access controls she personally held over the North Star launch sequence would shift to the next designated executive, the COO. Vivian looked at the device Noah had placed on the conference table, then at the modified safety report, then at the contractor ledger. She told Noah she was not yet prepared to accept everything he was saying without independent verification, and he said that was reasonable and that he was not asking her to. He was asking her to do one thing: lock the executive access floor and hold the launch until the verification was complete. Grant said halting the launch costs the company hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and investor confidence, and that it would destroy the congressional support the North Star program depended on. Vivian authorized the floor lockdown without responding to him. Then Noah told her something that made the room go very still. The dormant code he had flagged inside the routing module was not waiting for the launch. It had been programmed to activate on its own countdown, and that countdown had 35 hours remaining. The problem with Dead Switch was not simply that it existed, it was where it existed. Noah spent 20 minutes at the whiteboard explaining what his 4 months inside the system had taught him, and the picture he drew was not one that allowed for easy solutions. The North Star grid had already been integrated in a live capacity with 3 active rail corridors running through the greater Graybridge metropolitan area, meaning that the test network was no longer entirely theoretical. It was touching real infrastructure, real switching systems, real emergency brake protocols that active trains used during their daily operations. Disconnecting the network cleanly would require a sequenced shutdown executed in a specific order, and that specific order required access to a master authorization code that lived inside the routing module itself, in the same partition where Dead Switch had been installed. Dead Switch had been designed by whoever planted it to resist exactly that kind of intervention. It contained a counter-intrusion protocol that would interpret an unauthorized shutdown attempt as a trigger event and accelerate its own activation. Lena Carver's data arrived by secure transfer at 9:40 in the morning, and it filled in the financial architecture that Noah had not yet been able to prove directly. Lena was a senior financial analyst attached to the same federal task force as Noah, and she had spent the 4 months of the investigation tracing contractor payments that never quite led to companies that could be verified as real. The report she sent documented 7 entities that had collectively received over $480 million in subcontractor disbursements from the North Star budget, and it documented the common thread that connected all 7. Every one of them traced back to a private investment vehicle registered in Delaware called Halston Strategic Holdings, incorporated 22 years earlier under a name slightly different from the fund it had since become, in a way specifically designed to survive a routine name search without triggering a conflict of interest flag. Grant's response was to deny ownership and state that his digital signature on the relevant transfer authorizations had been forged, the same way Vivian's credentials had been used without her consent, and he said it with the same steady conviction he had deployed for every other denial in the previous 2 hours, which was exactly the kind of response that was impossible to immediately disprove. Pierce produced a new document, a technical access log, showing that Noah's own maintenance credential had been used to access the North Star routing module at 2:17 in the morning, on the date of the near-collision incident 3 months earlier. The implication was clear. If Noah had been inside the system before the incident occurred, he was not an investigator but a participant. Noah confirmed the access without blinking and said he had entered the system at 2:17, because he had received an automated alert indicating anomalous command traffic in the routing module, and the access log Pierce was holding confirmed that Noah had not sent any commands, only read a packet capture that he had then transmitted to Lena's secure file repository. Vivienne sat between two versions of the same story and said nothing, which was something Noah had learned to read as a form of thinking rather than a form of indecision. Avery Sloan found the insurance clause in a filing neither Grant nor Pierce had mentioned. Lockwood Meridian's infrastructure liability policy had been restructured 4 months earlier, and the restructuring included a contingency clause worth just over $900 million that would activate if the North Star grid were placed under regulatory suspension following a safety incident. And the beneficiary in the event of that clause's activation was not Lockwood Meridian, but a capital investment group incorporated in the Cayman Islands 6 years earlier, under a name that Lena's financial trace would later link directly to Grant Halston's private holding network. Harold had by then begun his own internal review, and what he found confirmed the final piece of the pre-arrest architecture. The warrant paperwork for Noah's detention had been drafted and pre-signed by 2 of his own officers before Vivienne had placed a single call. Respond. The 2 officers whose names appeared on the pre-drafted warrant had both processed expense reimbursements in the previous 3 months through a contractor company whose registered address was a suite in the same building that housed one of Pierce Danner's private consulting operations. Harold pulled them from duty at 11 in the morning, without announcement, and without explanation to anyone outside his chain of command, and he arranged for the complete evidence file Noah's team had assembled to be transferred to a secure federal repository rather than held in the city precinct's evidence management system. The trap, as Noah explained it to Vivienne in a quiet corner of the conference room, while the rest of the floor buzzed with legal calls and security reviews, had been constructed with a specific logic. Pierce had entered the archive room 12 minutes before Noah arrived, using his own legitimate access credentials to place a drive in the tool bag that Noah kept in a maintenance locker on the same floor. He had then cut 17 seconds from the hallway camera feed, not the full recording, because a full blackout would have flagged the system automatically, but just enough to remove any footage of his own entry, and he had triggered the proximity alarm deliberately, timed to coincide with the moment Noah would be exiting after completing his own evidence collection run. He had alerted Vivienne rather than contacting security through the normal channel, because the goal was not to process a theft. It was to create a public arrest visible to the maximum number of executives and board observers. The purpose of the arrest had not been to convict Noah. It had been to expose him. Once Noah's identity was blown and his federal cover destroyed, the investigation would lose its embedded access. Any evidence he had gathered would face chain-of-custody challenges in court, and the task force would need months to rebuild its operational presence. More than enough time for the North Star launch to go forward, for the Dead Switch event to play out as planned, and for the post-incident restructuring of the company's leadership to proceed without interference. Vivienne listened to the reconstruction without interrupting, and when Noah finished, she asked the question that had been sitting in the room for the past several hours. Why had he not simply shown his credentials the moment she ordered the arrest? He told her that the moment someone is publicly cornered and reveals an escape, you learn nothing about who wanted them cornered. And by staying still and waiting, he had watched the room, and Grant had sent a message from his personal device within 90 seconds of the handcuffs going on, before any official notification had been routed through the building's communication system. The message had been partially recovered by Lena's software before an attempted remote wipe could complete, and it read, "Calder has been removed. Begin final phase." Grant called the recovered message a fabrication assembled from fragments and presented without proper forensic chain, and he said it from the center of the conference room with the particular comfort of a man who has spent decades understanding that the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. Noah did not push back on the denial. He said he did not yet have the final piece he needed to close the case against Grant directly, and that until he had it, the most dangerous thing anyone in the room could do was confront Grant in a way that would give him reason to accelerate the timeline. Vivian walked to the windows, looked at the city below for a moment, then turned back and offered a formal apology for having ordered the arrest before verifying the facts. Noah accepted it and told her that the only thing the apology needed to mean was a decision about what came next. She granted full system access to Noah's team, and within 3 hours the forensic sweep had returned the full blueprint for what Grant had been building toward. A 12-step post-incident protocol that began with Vivian's suspension, moved to Grant's interim appointment as CEO, and ended with the sale of the North Star control architecture to a private syndicate that existed in the same shadow network as Halston Strategic Holdings. Grant Halston made his offer in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds, placed at a time he calculated would find Noah alone. Late afternoon, between the end of the main forensic review session and the start of the evening legal debrief. He did not admit to anything directly, because he had spent 30 years making sure he was never the man in the room when something that could be admitted happened. Instead, he said that a man with a 19-year-old daughter studying system analysis at a university he named precisely and without hesitation had certain priorities that a federal salary could not easily support, and that $5 million transferred to an account of Noah's choosing before midnight would allow both of them to move forward from a situation that was still, technically, without a conclusion. He said it pleasantly, in the tone of a man who has just offered a very reasonable trade and is doing you the courtesy of pretending you have a genuine choice. And he ended the call without waiting for a response. Within the hour, Noah's identity had been leaked to a news service, not the major wire services, but a regional outlet that covered Maryland state politics and had a particular appetite for federal agency stories that made government investigators look overreaching and unaccountable. 3 reporters showed up near Tessa Calder's university campus before the evening was over, and a 4th reached out to her department's administrative office asking for a faculty statement about a student connected to an ongoing federal investigation. Noah found out through the alert system Lena had set up for exactly this kind of breach, and the feeling that moved through him when he read the notification was not fear but something colder and more familiar. The particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years performing the calculation between what the work requires and what it costs the person who did not choose the work. He sat with it for 20 minutes, and then Vivian's legal team issued an injunction blocking publication of any information linking Tessa to the case, on grounds of protected third-party privacy in an active federal investigation, and the stories did not run. Vivian told Noah privately that she had authorized the injunction not because the investigation required it, but because it was the right thing to do, and that he was free to walk away from Graybridge and hand the active case file to whichever colleague he trusted most, and that she would not hold it against him. He appreciated the precision of it. She was not asking him to stay, which meant that if he stayed, it would be because he chose to. Tessa called him at 8:15 in the evening and said she had seen the coverage attempt and wanted him to know she was fine. And then she said the thing that settled it. That she did not need him to disappear in order to feel protected, and that what she needed was for him to come home when it was finished, without carrying the weight of something left undone. Noah arranged a meeting with Grant for the following morning at a decommissioned maintenance depot on the eastern edge of the city, One of the transit facilities deactivated when the North Star project began absorbing funding from the older line infrastructure, a building with no active cameras and no staff, which was precisely why Grant accepted without asking questions. Noah wore a concealed audio recorder, and Grant was careful not to say anything that constituted a direct confession, but he said enough. He said the disruption event would last exactly 12 minutes. That 12-minute window was the number he had tested and the number that worked. He asked for the encrypted drive in exchange for the $5 million, and when Noah said he needed to verify the transfer before releasing the drive, Grant pulled out a device and authorized a test transaction from an account registered to a company called Meridian Capital Solutions. Lena traced the account before Grant's car reached the highway, and what she found on the other end of the transaction was a short-selling position against Lockwood Meridian stock worth $230 million. The decision to allow the launch ceremony to proceed in a modified form that the public and investment community would perceive as normal, but that Noah and Vivienne had spent the preceding night quietly gutting of everything that could go wrong, was not made easily and not made without disagreement. Lena argued for a full federal shutdown of the network, filing charges immediately and letting the courts manage the fallout. Harold said a public shutdown would tip off Grant's financial contacts before the trading positions could be frozen, allowing the short-selling network to unwind before the regulatory freeze hit. Noah pointed out that Dead Switch had been designed to activate on its own timeline, regardless of whether the launch happened, which meant that pulling the ceremony would not stop the code. It would only remove the controlled environment in which they had the best chance of containing it. Vivienne said nothing during the argument and then asked a single question. If they ran the plan correctly, would anyone get hurt? Noah said, not if they did it right. She said then they would do it right. Through the night, they worked in 3 parallel tracks. The engineering team that Noah's task force had embedded at key switching stations along the North Star corridor quietly converted the 3 demonstration trains from live operation to a maintenance-only status that looked identical on the external monitoring feed but isolated them from the active routing commands. The mechanical brake systems on each unit were physically decoupled from the dead switch module at the hardware level, not through software, because anything in the software layer was visible to Grant's monitoring access, but through manual disconnections at the relay boards inside each cab, performed by technicians who were told only that a regulatory inspection required it. A parallel shadow network was constructed overnight in the basement server room of the Transit Authority's Secondary Operations Center, 3 blocks from Lockwood Tower, a mirror of the North Star routing architecture that would receive the dead switch commands and respond to them with realistic system behavior, buying time while the real network remained isolated. Vivienne issued a public statement at 7 in the morning, confirming that the launch was proceeding as scheduled and that Noah Calder had been removed from site access pending a review of the prior day's incident. The statement was precisely written and precisely false in the ways that mattered, and every major outlet that covered the North Star project ran it without questioning its basic premise. By mid-morning, Noah was operating out of a repurposed equipment room on the ground floor of the Transit Authority building, running the response team through a command structure that had no record in any official system. Pierce found the room. Noah had considered the possibility and had left a deliberate trace in the building's entry log, not enough to make it obvious but enough that a man who was actively looking and knew his operational habits could piece it together if he was patient and thorough. Pierce reported the location to Grant before noon, and the information did what Noah had intended. It convinced Grant that waiting for the scheduled launch window carried more risk than moving early. At 12:40 in the afternoon, With the ceremony still 7 hours away, and the transit corridors running their normal midday service, the North Star system began receiving commands that did not originate from the Lockwood Meridian Operations Center. Routing signals on 3 lines shifted from green to red without operator input, and the 2 maintenance trains began receiving contradictory movement instructions from a source outside the standard command hierarchy. Noah watched the shadow network absorb the incoming commands and understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, that Grant had decided a controlled event during the busiest hours of the day would cause more damage than a polished ceremony. The countdown clock on the secondary monitor read 12 minutes. Noah moved to the channel connecting the 5 switching station supervisors who had been briefed and positioned along the demonstration corridor. His instructions were precise and fast. Each station was to complete a manual override to mechanical control within 90 seconds, isolating their segment of track from any digital command regardless of origin. Using the physical lever systems that existed in every switching station as a regulatory requirement, and that Grant had not thought to account for because he had never spent time in a switching station and did not know what the levers were for. 4 of the 5 stations confirmed the override within the window. The 5th came back with a jammed mechanism and a 12-second delay, which was 12 seconds longer than the plan had allowed for. And Noah held his breath in the way that people hold their breath when the number they are counting toward is the number that separates a recoverable situation from one that is not. Vivienne did not leave the operations center. She had been advised to step back and let the technical team handle the response, and she had listened to the advice and then disregarded it, because she had decided somewhere during the previous night that the difference between a leader and an administrator was whether you were present when the thing you built was being tested. She got on the direct line to the managers for each of the 3 affected corridors and identified herself and told them exactly what was happening. Not a sanitized version, not a reassurance, but the operational truth, and she told them what she needed from each of them and told them she was staying on the line. The dead switch sequence executed as designed. False signals locked the digital display boards. The routing interface on the operations center monitors showed command authority transferred to a designation code that corresponded to Vivienne's executive account, and the 2 maintenance trains began accelerating toward each other on what the system believed was a shared approach to the central demonstration junction. Noah could not delete the dead switch code directly. Any attempt to access the code partition during an active execution cycle would trigger the failsafe, a complete emergency brake deployment across all 3 corridors simultaneously, which would strand trains mid-segment and block emergency vehicle access along 3 major transit arteries, creating exactly the kind of visible public infrastructure failure that Grant's short position was built to profit from. Instead, Noah needed Dead Switch to believe it had succeeded. He needed to construct a command sequence that mimicked the aftermath of a completed disruption event in a way that would satisfy the code's completion criteria and cause it to stand down before the real trains reached the junction point. Vivienne entered her executive authentication code into the command interface and held Noah's gaze for exactly the length of time it took her to understand what she was authorizing, which was a record that would show her account generating the commands that neutralized the crisis and could later be framed by a hostile attorney as evidence that she had been at the controls all along. She entered it anyway. The 2 maintenance trains were redirected onto separate auxiliary branches before they reached the shared segment, one toward the eastern maintenance depot, one toward the northern staging yard, and both came to a controlled stop within their respective safe zones while Dead Switch logged its own completion and began its post-execution cleanup cycle. Lena's passive monitoring tools, running in the Shadow Network's data layer, captured the source address of every command packet that Dead Switch had transmitted during its 12-minute window, and the source address resolved to a terminal on the private executive floor of Lockwood Tower. The floor accessible only to Grant Halston and the two personal staff members who worked under his direct supervision. Pierce had locked the central operations room and was attempting to physically remove the backup drive array when Harold Brenner arrived on the floor with a search warrant and 3 federal officers. And the expression on Pierce's face when he saw the paperwork was the expression of a man who has just understood that the person who promised to protect him is the same person who wrote his name on every document that needed a fall. Grant called the emergency board meeting himself, which was the kind of move that only a very confident man or a very desperate one makes when the walls are already closing, and in Grant's case, the line between the two had always been thinner than the people who admired him understood. He stood at the head of the table on the executive conference floor at 4:30 in the afternoon and told the assembled board and senior legal staff that Vivian had ignored documented safety warnings, that Noah Calder had conducted an illegal system intervention under the cover of a federal investigation that exceeded its authorized scope, and that Pierce Danner had acted without instruction from anyone above him and would face whatever consequences the evidence supported. He said it with the practiced authority of a man presenting a quarterly report, structured, calm, and already anticipating the questions. He did not know, when he said it, that 3 people had walked into the building behind him. Noah came in with Harold on his left and Lena Carver on his right, and Avery Sloan stepped in from the side hallway where she had been waiting, and the 4 of them arranged themselves at the far end of the table with the particular quiet confidence of people who have been carrying a weight for a long time and have decided this is where they set it down. Grant looked at Noah the way men look at problems they thought they had already solved, and he made one last attempt at narrative control. He called Noah a contractor with a badge who had leveraged a federal credential to interfere in a private enterprise, and he invited the board to consider who had more institutional credibility, a company that had been building public infrastructure for 40 years, or a man who had spent 4 months pretending to fix circuit boards. Lena opened her laptop and began presenting without preamble. The financial trace covered every transaction in the 7 shell company network, every disbursement from the North Star budget that had passed through Halston Strategic Holdings, and every short-selling position that had been opened against Lockwood Meridian stock in the 3 months preceding the planned disruption event, a position that would have generated returns of over $200 million if the network failure had gone forward as designed. The Dead Switch command log showed the origin terminal with a precision that no forensic challenge could reasonably contest. The audio recording from the maintenance depot captured Grant's 12-minute calculation, his description of what the aftermath would look like, and his instruction to Noah to leave the city, and even filtered through the limitations of a concealed device in an open space. It was clear enough. Pierce's phone, surrendered to Harold in exchange for a cooperation agreement, contained 17 months of direct instruction messages, operational timelines, access code changes, the specific camera segment to cut, and the exact language of the pre-drafted arrest warrant. Avery placed the final document on the table. A cross-referenced audit showing that Grant had intercepted and suppressed 17 internal safety reports over 2 years before they reached Vivian's desk, replacing them with edited summaries that removed every finding above a threshold that would have required executive notification. Vivian stood before the board and said plainly that she had ordered a federal agent arrested without verification, that she had been wrong to do so, and that the board should factor her judgment in that moment into whatever assessment of her leadership they thought was necessary. Harold stepped forward when Grant attempted to leave, and the federal officers who had entered behind Noah's group completed the arrest with the kind of efficiency that is only possible when the paperwork has been finished for several hours and everyone is simply waiting for the right moment to use it. The charges were read without ceremony: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal contract fraud, bribery of public officials, deliberate interference with a federally funded transportation system, obstruction of a federal investigation, and securities fraud conspiracy. When the room was quiet again, Grant turned to Noah and asked, in the flat tone of a man with nothing left to protect, why a senior federal agent would spend 4 months letting people treat him like a repairman. Noah looked at him for a moment and said, "Because the guilty tend to talk freely when they believe the man standing in front of them has no power." The legal proceedings that followed were efficient in the way that cases are efficient when the evidence is extensive and the cooperation from secondary defendants is willing and early. Pierce entered a plea agreement within 2 weeks of the arrest, providing testimony that confirmed the timeline of the archive setup, the camera manipulation, and the chain of instruction he had received through encrypted messages over the preceding 8 months. The 2 officers Harold had suspended were investigated by the State Ethics Commission and by the federal authorities simultaneously, and both were separated from the department before the first court date. Grant Halston was held without bail on the securities fraud count alone, and the judge at his preliminary hearing noted, without apparent sympathy, that the size of the short position and the precision of its timing suggested a level of premeditation that was not consistent with the bail conditions Grant's attorneys had proposed. The North Star grid was placed under an independent safety commission review, not dismantled, because Noah had submitted documentation to the Federal Transportation Office, confirming that the core routing architecture was structurally sound, and that the fraud had been layered over a system that, properly audited and rebuilt, represented a genuine advance in rail safety management. The review was scheduled to take 14 months, and Vivienne accepted the timeline without complaint and began the restructuring the review required. The Safety Compliance Division was separated from the COO's operational authority and given direct reporting access to the board. Every risk classified finding above a defined severity threshold was required to reach the CEO's desk unedited and within 24 hours. No single executive could hold simultaneous authority over operational data and financial audit functions, and a protected disclosure channel was established for engineering staff to report safety concerns outside the normal management hierarchy. She announced the changes at a company-wide meeting and announced them without a communications consultant in the room. Vivienne issued a formal public apology to Noah at the same meeting, not a legal statement, not a carefully hedged expression of institutional regret, but a direct acknowledgement that she had acted on incomplete information presented by someone she had trusted, that she had not stopped to verify before she acted, and that the man she had placed in handcuffs had been protecting the passengers of a transit system she was responsible for building safely. Noah declined the company's offer of a formal advisory role within the Lockwood Meridian organizational structure, accepting instead a consulting position with an independent rail safety oversight body that would review the rebuilt North Star architecture before it returned to service. Harold told him, at a quiet dinner the week after the arrests, that the next time Noah had a badge in his pocket, he could show it before the handcuffs went on. And Noah said the handcuffs had turned out to be useful. Tessa came back to Graybridge the month the legal proceedings were formally filed, and she met Vivienne over a dinner that had no press presence and no agenda. And Vivienne found herself looking at a 19-year-old who had her father's quality of watching a room with more attention than she showed. 6 months later, when the independent safety review had cleared the rebuilt network for controlled testing, Vivian extended an invitation to Noah to ride the first verified run. He arrived at the platform and asked whether she had verified the identity of every passenger before boarding. She looked at the federal credential in his hand, the same black card that had stopped a room, removed a pair of handcuffs, and changed the direction of a morning, and said, "Just one. I arrested the wrong man last time." The doors closed behind them as the train moved out onto the track that both of them had worked to make safe, carrying them forward through the network they had pulled back from the edge of disaster, built on honesty where it had once been built on concealment.